When you think about U.S. foreign policy today, involvement in the Middle East is just a given. It's a huge part of the picture. But this deep, complex relationship didn't start with some grand strategic plan. It actually kicked off with something much, much simpler: a business deal for a single resource that was becoming the lifeblood of global power. Oil.
So that's the big question we're tackling here. How on earth did a straightforward business deal for oil spiral into decades of military and political entanglement? It's really a story of cascading events where every decision, which seemed pretty logical at the time, ended up creating a whole new set of problems nobody saw coming.
All right, let's rewind the clock to the 1930s. Back then, the United States really wasn't a major player in the Middle East, but after World War I, one lesson was crystal clear. If you wanted to be a world power, you needed oil. And that realization started pointing American businesses toward one particular part of the world. So, a private American oil company gets the green light to start looking for oil in Saudi Arabia. For years, they found nothing. It was looking like a bust. Then, on March 3, 1938, they hit the jackpot. And that discovery, that was the moment everything changed. It was the beginning of the first real, long-term American community in the kingdom, with engineers, managers, and their families all moving in. Now you have to understand what a massive gamble this was. At the time, this is how the area was described: a huge, empty, brutal landscape. The company was pouring a ton of money into this project with absolutely no guarantee they'd ever see a dime back. It was a high-stakes bet on a place that was, to most Westerners, a complete mystery. And this partnership wasn't just about business, it was a culture clash waiting to happen. The deal was with a kingdom built on a very strict interpretation of Islam, a place deeply suspicious of outside influence. So as these American communities popped up with their own customs, like women driving cars, for example, it created a lifestyle that was a complete contrast with the laws of the country they were in. You could feel the friction from the very beginning. And this one little detail just perfectly illustrates the tightrope they were walking. When the U.S. wanted to build its first military airstrip, the Saudi king agreed, but with one condition: you cannot fly the American flag here. It might seem like a small thing, but it was a huge symbolic compromise. It showed that the monarchy needed American protection, but was also really worried about how a visible foreign army would look to its own people. Okay, so now we get to the next phase, where this whole relationship gets a massive rewrite because of world events. The Cold War kicks off, and suddenly, U.S. involvement isn't just about economics anymore. It becomes almost entirely about strategy. The number one goal? Containing the Soviet Union.
So you see, what started as this one little dot on the map, this oil operation in eastern Saudi Arabia, began to change. The focus wasn't just on protecting this one business venture anymore.
Instead, American policymakers started looking at the entire Middle East through the lens of the Cold War. Every country was now a piece on the chessboard in the global game against the USSR. Keeping the oil flowing was still important, of course, but it was now just one part of a much bigger geopolitical strategy. So the U.S. suddenly had this whole new checklist of priorities in the region. Job one was to block Soviet influence at every turn. They also had to keep the oil moving to their allies in the West. This even meant getting involved in overthrowing governments they thought were getting too cozy with Moscow, like what happened in Iran in 1953. And of course, a huge part of the strategy was giving major military and financial backing to Israel, who they saw as their key ally in the region. Now, as the U.S. got more and more involved, both politically and militarily, you can bet people in the region started to notice. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. It sparked very real reactions. A great way to understand this is to zoom in on the story of one single, very well-known Saudi family, and the completely different roads two generations decided to take. On one hand, you have the father, Osama bin Laden. He was a brilliant businessman whose construction company got incredibly rich by building projects for the American oil companies and the Saudi government. For him, the U.S. presence was a golden opportunity. But then you have his son, Osama, who grew up seeing this close partnership with a foreign, non-Muslim power as a massive fundamental problem. From his perspective, having American influence, and especially American troops, in Saudi Arabia, the home of Mecca and Medina, was just an unacceptable violation. He started to see his own government, and even his own family, as collaborators with a foreign superpower that he deeply opposed.
And this belief, it's what sent him down a specific path. He went to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet invasion. He spent a decade there getting battle-hardened in a brutal war. And here's the wild historical irony. The very same fighters he was supporting were also getting secret help from the CIA because the US saw it as a perfect chance to bleed the Soviets dry. When that war was over, bin Laden created al-Qaeda, a group with a new mission: to fight foreign influence in the Muslim world.
This brings us to a real turning point, a pivotal moment in 1990, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. This single act would pour gasoline on the fire, dramatically scaling up the U.S. role in the region from just a presence to a massive permanent military deployment.
So, imagine you're the Saudi monarchy. Saddam Hussein's huge, experienced army is suddenly right on your border. It's a direct threat to your country, your oil fields, everything. You have to make a choice, and fast. Who do you call for help? The decision they made would echo for decades.
And basically, two very different offers landed on the table. Osama bin Laden came to them and offered his network of fighters fresh from the war in Afghanistan to defend the kingdom. On the other hand, the United States offered the full, awesome power of its military. We're talking total air and ground superiority.
The Saudi leadership, well, they didn't think much of bin Laden's offer. They saw it as completely unrealistic for this kind of fight. A senior prince famously shot him down, saying that the guerrilla tactics that worked in the mountains of Afghanistan wouldn't do much against tanks in the flat open desert. They chose the option with more firepower.
So the choice was made, and the U.S. didn't come alone. They put together this massive international coalition of 38 countries to kick Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. The military operation that followed was incredibly fast and decisive. And this right here is the absolute key takeaway. To launch this huge invasion, the U.S. built a whole network of massive military bases in Saudi Arabia and nearby countries. But after the war was over, what was supposed to be a temporary mission became a permanent stay. The troops, the bases, the firepower, it all remained. That decision, to host a permanent U.S. military force on the Arabian Peninsula, became the trigger. It set a whole new chain of events into motion, and it cemented many of the tough security problems that America is still dealing with in the region today. For Osama bin Laden and people who thought like him, this was it. This was the ultimate act of betrayal by the Saudi government. Having non-Muslim troops stationed permanently near Islam's holiest places confirmed everything he believed. And it made him pivot al-Qaeda's entire mission. The main enemy was no longer the Soviet Union. It was now the United States. So when you step back and look at the whole timeline, you can see this clear, repeating cycle. It starts with a commercial interest that leads to a strategic presence. That presence then stirs up local resentment. That resentment helps fuel radical movements. And then the actions of those movements lead to even more direct military intervention from the U.S., which just starts the cycle all over again. This whole journey, from a single oil deal to this tangled web of military and political commitments, is really the backstory for so much of what's happening now. And it leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. How do the long-term, and often completely unintended, consequences of those past decisions continue to define the challenges the world is facing?